yeah, that's me. Move on to the next slide quickly. So this is a graph that I think is quite interesting, and what the point it's trying to tell you is that the richest 10% of people across the world are responsible for 49% of carbon emissions. And obviously, the richest 10% have the most money. So they have over half of the global wealth. And how do they use that wealth? They use it by having a carbon lifestyle, driving nice cars, going on lots of holidays and all those sorts of things. And then the bottom, poorest 50% of the world only contribute 10% of carbon emissions across the globe. But as I'm sure you're aware, climate change is already impacting those poorer countries through flooding, through droughts, and other extreme weather events. So that to me is not fair. And just to make it clear, that the north of Tyne and the northeast region, yes, we do have poorer people, but we are all in that richest 10% of the world, which means that we all have to do our fair share. But nationally and regionally, we have to go further and faster because we've caused most of it. And actually, us making a change will have much more impact than asking all of these poorer countries to also make significant changes. Our next slide is quite a scary picture, but I find it quite powerful. So this is an image of what the world might look like if global temperatures rise by 4 degrees. And the Greenland is places where people can still live. The temperature still means that it can support life, but also do farming there. The yellow land is desert and people can't live there. And the brown land is areas of the globe where people can't live due to flooding or drought. And so this really, to me, brings home the message of where it's going to impact most. And you might look at this and think, well, we're going to be all right. We're still green. Yeah, well, we might lose a bit of London due to flooding, but who cares? We're in the northeast. We'll be all right. But the question you've got to ask yourself is, where are all those people going to go? Where are the, hundreds of millions of people who live in India going to go, for example? And so the impact of that unfairness is going to impact upon everybody across the globe. And lastly, I just wanted to touch a bit more locally and on the population in the UK. So I'm sure you're very aware that flooding is something we see much more frequently here in the UK now. Since 2007, I think we've had a serious flood incident almost every year. And I suppose this again is an unfair impact of climate change, because poorer people living in areas which are more prone to flooding don't have the resources to pay for insurance, don't have the resources to protect their homes from flooding in the first place, aren't able to just, find some money and go and stay in a hotel for a few days. So they're immediately disadvantaged in terms of being able to respond when they find themselves in that situation. And then there's a real worry that climate change will bring about a rise in the cost of living. So if agriculture becomes more difficult, food costs will rise, energy costs are likely to rise, and because of increased flooding and gales and things like that, insurance costs are likely to rise. So for those people in communities who are already struggling to make ends meet, this is going to have a real impact on their lives. And I just want to remind people that 1 in 4 children in the northeast are living in poverty at the moment. So it's a significant proportion of our population in this region that this is going to impact on.
1 minute left, Carole.
Thank you. I'm on my very last point, so that's fine. So the other thing is around, there are great opportunities in the green revolution. Electric cars are cheaper to run, PV panels on your roof, you can get cheaper electricity. If you super insulate your home, it will cost you far less to heat. But the problem is that for the people that could benefit most from these things, they can't afford them. And so how is that fair? And the last point I want to make is around representation and voice. The people that this is going to impact don't often get the chance to talk about how it's going to impact them and how they feel. So I think this sort of forum is brilliant for that. And I think for you, we need to think about every solution you come up with, what's going to be the impact on poorer people, and how can we make sure they benefit as much as richer people.
Thank you, Carole. Beautifully done in the time. Thank you so much. If you could just bring your slides off so we can see everybody, that would be great. And I do stay on, Carole, because we're going to have a chance to talk in groups. So we're going to do a big round of applause at the end for all the speakers, but I'm going to move us on to our next speaker. So Beth Farhat, she's the Regional Secretary of the Trades Union Congress, the TUC. Beth, I'll leave it to you to say anything more about yourself, but very welcome. Yeah. Again, I'll keep it for you.
Lovely, and I will need that minute to chop me off. I don't have any slides. I was just going to talk at you really, and then obviously if there's a Q&A or if you want to follow up after that, no problem. So the Trade Union Congress represents around 5.6 million workers on a whole range of issues. So I'm going to talk to you about fairness in terms of moving to net zero through the lens of a workplace and a worker perspective. And I think, you know, greening the workplace and talking about environmental issues has been on the trade union agenda for years and years. But obviously the move to decarbonise our economy has the potential to offer really exciting opportunities for the UK, the North East, but it's got to be done right. And I think at present, we have, our view is that there's a lack of comprehensive just transition policy. What that means is, how are we going to get one group of workers that work in a high carbon industries to low carbon industries in a fair and just way that takes them, takes workers along with them, but also gives them good quality jobs. And at the moment, there isn't a map or a route way kind of to do that. And I think for us, you know, we need to have that nationally and regionally to be able to implement it through organisations like the North of Tyne Combined Authority or a Just Transition Commission that brings together all the key players to pull these strategies together. Because we can have all these ideas, but if we haven't got the resources to deliver it, then we can't do much. So what a just transition for us means is that the reality is many high paid, well, you know, unionised jobs, highly skilled jobs are under threat in the North if we don't get the strategy right. We don't want to move to a place where we get left behind, because if we, you know, I'll give you some examples like what happened in the 80s to mining communities, but also what happened more recently on Teesside. We're still bearing the brunt of that. And this is, you know, there are huge challenges for us in terms of getting it right. So energy intensive industries, including things like energy, transport, manufacturing and construction, are going to be key to achieving this transition. And this is the project I think is going to, like I said, require lots of change, but you need to engage workers in the transition and in the conversation around this, but also citizens like we're doing tonight with you. So the voice of workers at the forefront of this got to be at the heart of that change. And I think we all do, us as citizens, and I think what we're doing tonight is a great way to take this forward, that you have direct opportunity to influence change in your communities. That's absolutely brilliant. But we know the world of work is changing through digitalization, automation, and COVID has had a massive impact on service sectors. And we know the only way that we're going to get out of recovery is if we have good jobs. So we need a strategy to get good employment in our communities. We've been calling for just transition commissions to be set up in regions, so bringing together employers, unions, industry, workers to pull together these strategies so we can influence government to get more investment in big infrastructure projects. Because we did some research and we found that 30,000 jobs could be created across the North East in the construction sector, investing in green infrastructure, boosting research and development into battery technology. So we've got the foundations to work with, we've got the skills, we just kind of need the funding and the strategy, if you like. And of course, one of the other things we have to do is in our workplaces, so make sure unionised workplaces are pulling together just transition agreements, negotiating with employers to make sure that they're looking at the number of jobs that will be impacted, the pay, the terms and conditions, the health and safety, and the equal opportunities as well that kind of come with that. There's a big skills element to this as well. Taking one set of workers and retraining them in another area is going to involve funding and support, but also developing new green apprenticeships and scholarships for young people to come through? Why can't somebody from retail who wants to work in a green job, in an emerging sector, you know, making sure that they can access training to be able to get into those jobs as well, but also knowing about those jobs in the first place. One of the
about 30 seconds.
Yeah, the other thing for me is diversifying kind of the energy sector and making sure that we get more women and people of colour into these jobs as well, but also making sure that actually people from working class communities have an opportunity to have an ambition and aspiration to work in the green sector as well. So I'll end there.
Beth, thanks so much. Deep breath. No, you covered a lot of ground there, and hopefully you can stay on just so anybody won't have any questions in the smaller groups. But thank you so much. And given the announcement, the budget today, it seems very timely having you here. So great. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Sir Geoff Palmer. He's a professor in the School of Life Sciences at Heriot-Watt University, Edinburgh. He's also a distinguished human rights specialist, and we're very pleased to have you here, Sir Geoff.
Well, thank you very much. And I think the first speaker said, you know, something about flooding in, you know, past-colonial countries and elsewhere. And what I'm going to do is because we're at the moment discussing slavery and colonialism, I would just like to bring a new angle on something which may not have been thought of before. Now, slavery was about deforestation. You know, Jamaica was regarded as the land of wood and water when it was discovered by Christopher Columbus. And if you look at Jamaica now, you know, the island was deforested to make plantations to grow sugar and coffee. And what is the consequences of that? The consequences of that deforestation is that we now have significant land erosion in the West Indies and countries which, you know, were used to grow sugar and coffee. And you know, I've seen pictures of when it rains in excess in these countries, the soil erosion is unbelievable. In fact, it's also dangerous. And therefore, you know, I think it's unfair that, you know, we talk about climate change, but we don't talk about the consequences of changes that were brought about to benefit the economy of European countries. And for example, I watched the Jamaica Prime Minister the other day, where he was inaugurating a scheme to provide new piping to transport water. Jamaica is a land of wood and water, to provide water in areas which water has disappeared over the 200 years. And that costs the country $25 million. Now, it's unfair because that money could be spent on other aspects or health and other areas that, you know, are needed. And thus, when we now talk about trying to redress, you know, some of the things in the past, then this is one aspect that we should consider, that we change the climate in order to provide plantations. And we now have the consequences exacerbated by, you know, excess rain and excess drought. And thus, when we consider, you know, our role in the past, these are things we should take into consideration. And linked in a small way, because our Windrush generation in Britain, which, you know, require support, they are the the products of this climate change, which occurred, a couple hundred years ago, in order to benefit the economy of this country. And therefore, it's not about, revenge or anything like that. It's about, we should consider very carefully, what's happened in the past. And it's not just the past, but it's the consequences. We cannot change the past, but we can change the consequences for the better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Geoff. Really important, this perspective you're bringing into the mix. And again, hopefully you can stay on if people have any questions in their small groups, they'd like to expand on that with you. So if you can, that would be fantastic. Without further ado then, I'm going to bring in on our last commentator and sort of looking, as we're done with Geoff, looking in a sense to close the past, we're now looking to the future and future generations and the issue of intergenerational justice, which Roman Krznaric will say a little bit more. Roman is a public philosopher and author of the book, The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World. You're very welcome, Roman. And again, I'll keep an eye on the clock for you and give you a 1-minute warning if that helps.
Thanks for that introduction, Liz, and hello to all of you. I want to talk about why it's so important we think about the long-term impacts of climate change on future generations. And I think the key reason really is that we live in an incredibly short-term world. We all know our politicians can't see beyond the next election, or businesses beyond the quarterly report, and we're looking at our phones and clicking the buy now button. This is the age of the tyranny of the now. And you think about climate change, well, the impacts are incredibly long term. I mean, sea levels are going to be rising for decades. The carbon's going to stay in the sky for centuries, long after we are gone. And in fact, at no time in human history have we had such devastating potential impacts on future generations. And the unfairness, of course, is that those future generations aren't here to do anything about this pillaging of their inheritance. They're given no political rights or representation. And if you think about it, look, there's 7.7 billion of us alive today, but over the next 2 centuries alone, tens of billions of people will be born, assuming current birth rates level off and stabilize this century. So amongst those billions are all your grandchildren and their grandchildren and the friends and communities on whom they'll depend. And I think if there's one question which really sums up this issue, it's this: are we being good ancestors? In other words, how are we going to be remembered by all those future generations for what we did or didn't do when we had the chance? But it's quite difficult to bring those future generations into our minds. They can become quite abstract, I think. So I want to take you on a little thought experiment for a moment. I'd like you all to just close your eyes for a moment and just imagine in your mind's eye a young person in your life who you really care about. It could be a nephew or niece or one of your own kids or grandchildren. Just picture their face for a moment. And now, still with your eyes shut, I want you to imagine them 30 years in the future. Picture their face. Think about the joys in their life or the struggles they might be facing. And now, with your eyes still closed, I want you to imagine them on their 90th birthday. They're 90 years old and surrounded by family and friends and loved ones and work colleagues. Go and have a look out the window. What kind of world is it out there? And now, just when they're about to make their birthday speech for being 90, amazing age to reach, so they suddenly see a photograph of you, their departed ancestor, over on the mantelpiece, and decide instead to tell the gathered room about the legacy that you left them and to their world. Just think for a moment with your eyes still closed about what they said about you and what you did and the legacy you left them. And now just open your eyes again. And of course, that kind of exercise can be quite confronting if you've got a dark vision of the future. But, just think of that 90-year-old. I think of my daughter, now 12, when she's 90, it could be nearly the year 2100. That future isn't science fiction. It's an intimate family fact. And if I care about her life in the future, I've got to care about all life, the air she breathes, the water she drinks, those long-term impacts of climate change. So we need to use our imaginations to jump forward in time, but also recognize we need to change our political systems so they've got more long-termism into them. And there's great examples to look at that you might discuss in your future meetings over the next few weeks. In Wales, for example, there's a Future Generations Commissioner whose job is to look at the long-term impacts, at least 30 years from today, on future generations in areas like healthcare or environment or employment. In Japan, there's this amazing movement called Future Design, which invites local people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. And they're given these amazing orange robes to wear. I've got one of them here from the small town of Yahaba. And when they wear these robes, they imagine themselves as being from the year 2060. And it turns out when they're imagining themselves in 2060 in those robes, they come up with much more radical and transformative plans for their towns and cities, whether it's long-term healthcare investment or action on climate change. And then there are companies like the renewable energy company, Good Energy, which has a children's board, a board of teenagers who oversees the actions of the company in the main board looking decades ahead. So there's all these mechanisms out there that you can be discussing. And this is really about fairness, ultimately. It's about bringing the voice of future generations into the room so their voices and interests can be heard. And just think of, you know, in Northumberland, there's rock art going back 10,000 years. There've been people living in the region for centuries, millennia, and there's going to be people living long into the future. So let's bring that question into our minds. Are we being good ancestors? How are we going to be remembering all those generations to come? Thanks.